Hi, everyone. We're going to start in a few minutes. We're just waiting for some participants. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Celeste Schubert. I'm Vice President of Programs for New York City SHRM, and I want to welcome you all to our third Friday webinar. Today's topic is Algorithmic Hiring, DEI Implications and Regulatory Concerns. On July 5th, New York City will start enforcement of Local Law 144, the Automated Employment Decision Tool Law. This law will create a new compliance obligation for many businesses that hire in New York City and that use common HR tools like ATS assessments and interview technology. We want to extend a very special thank you to our partners. Our platinum sponsors are Jackson Lewis and Nava. We also have a wealth of other partners: Barst, Beacon Hill, Sentinel, Intrins, Gift of College, SDL, Mount Sinai Solutions, as well as Mutual of America. We have a couple of other things I'd like to announce that are coming up. On June 1st, we have another AI webinar, using AI to plan your learning and strategy and measure impact in person. Talent leaders struggle to understand which learning and development programs will have the greatest impact and for whom. AI, which is artificial intelligence, presents new opportunities for talent leaders to uncover insights to better plan and measure impact of learning and development strategies. Learn some practical methods using sentiment analysis of qualitative data to inform what behavioral outcomes are most likely to affect change in your organization. So we look forward to seeing you there. 1 week away, we are excited about our biennial conference. It's going to be held on April 28th. It will be in New York City at a location called Convene in Midtown. We really look forward to seeing everybody in person. We are also offering a special flash sale. If you want to come and you haven't registered yet, please feel free to use this code to get a little bit of a discount. We really encourage our members, as well as any of our guests, to please help us promote all of our events. We have a lot of people that work behind the scenes that really want to help you succeed in your career. Please connect with us by taking photos, using live tweets. You can find us on LinkedIn, our New York City SHRM Facebook, as well as our Twitter accounts. Today's webinar has been approved for SHRM credits. And as you can see, it's projected on the screen in front of you. So we appreciate you participating. Today, our guest speaker is John Rood. He is the CEO and founder of Perceptual. Thank you, John, for joining us today. John is founder and CEO of Perceptual.com. Perceptual provides compliance solutions for emerging regulation of automated and AI-driven tools for HR and people operations. John is on the board of JB Training Solutions, a leadership training consultancy, and Victory Lab, a sales training and placement platform. Prior to Perceptual, John was founder of Next Step Test Preparation, a market leader in pre-health and pre-medical test prep that sold to private equity. He is a graduate of the University of Chicago and Michigan State University. So once again, thank you, John, for joining us. And we look forward to learning more about AI.
Thanks, Celeste. I appreciate it. Let's see, did my slides pop up?
Yes, perfect.
There we go. Okay, we'll jump right in. So Celeste, thanks again for the intro. I don't think that I have much to add there other than what we do at Perceptual is exactly this work every day. So we're going to talk about New York City Local Law 144. We provide compliance for that. And just saying that so you get an idea of kind of what our context is. We are kind of in the trenches, so to speak, doing this work on a daily basis. And for the last decade plus, I've been working in testing, psychometrics, and statistical analysis. So this is all a very exciting time for everyone. Right before I jumped on today, I thought, everyone's excited about AI. It's in the news. It was just on CNN, or no, I'm sorry, on 60 Minutes. I'm sure it's on CNN all the time. And I jumped into DALL-E 2. So if you haven't seen DALL-E 2, I would suggest playing around with that in addition to Chat GPT. And I said, create an impressionist painting of the audience of an HR webinar on AI. And this is what it came up with automatically. So I love to show stuff like this because we're going to talk about AI from an HR perspective, from a compliance perspective today. So I'm going to try to keep it as not dry as possible as we go over what our future compliance obligations would be. But I always like to say, we're in this amazing time where we as professionals have this brand new set of tools. There is huge opportunity for using these tools to advance our careers, to advance our companies, and to get the right people into our company and give them the right opportunities. So as we talk about some of the road bumps and challenges to AI and using AI as HR professionals, we always think of the other side as well. I mean, these are tools with a lot of upside for sure. Here's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about what common HR tools use automated or AI-driven technology today. Secondly, we're going to talk about some of the potential ethical and DEI considerations of the use of AI. We are going to talk through some of the upcoming compliance requirements at a municipal, state, and federal level. And then as we're a New York audience, we're going to talk through New York City Local Law 144, which is really the first law that's specifically regulating the use of AI and automated tools in hiring, and then talk about what should we do based on all that information. I would love to make this as interactive as possible. So if you could pop open the Q&A tab anytime you want. I've got that open now, so I'll be taking a look at those as we talk through the slides. Feel free to leave your notes. I will probably try to answer a couple of questions as we go, and then at the end, definitely leaving some time for open Q&A for folks who would like to deep dive on any of this. So one of the things that I have heard a lot, and I heard it more 6 months ago than I hear now, is people that are using the HR tools that say, like, we don't really use AI. That may or may not be true. I do think that as we think about these tools, and especially as we get into kind of more of the compliance and regulation part of our discussion today, a lot of the new regulations are around not just like what we might consider like AI, but around what the laws call automated tools. So I always like to communicate to HR professionals that it's not like some like crazy new technology that's out there. It's the tools that we use really every day that use some of this technology. So a couple of examples of automated tools, whether they're AI or not, that may be regulated, that may have some of the challenges or roadblocks that we're going to discuss today. So by far the biggest is resume scanning and sorting. So I listed a couple of vendors here as examples. These vendors are not like particularly AI focused. They're just the tools that we use every day that have these features. But so when we think about resume scanning and sorting, think about just like that very basic process that we use where we put up a job posting, we get, to make the math easy, we get 100 applicants, and then our technology tells us, as hiring managers, here's the 20 or 30 candidates that you should look at closely and potentially bring on to the interview stage. So that action of kind of putting some candidates in and some candidates out, that's a really important thing, right? It matters a lot who the systems are choosing. So that's one example that we use every day. Secondly, pre-hire assessment technology. Now, pre-hire assessments have been around for many decades, and regulation on their proper use has been around for many decades as well. I just interviewed a lawyer out of Minneapolis who said he's been dealing with kind of the employment law pre-hire assessments for over 20 years. It's on our YouTube if anyone wants to check it out. So this is not a new area for us as HR professionals. It's not a new area of the law, but as new laws regulate AI-driven assessments more particularly, it's definitely an area where we want to keep an eye on it. The third is interview tools. So there's tons and tons of tools out there now that do, for example, like one-way interviewing. And that's really one of the easiest examples. If you think about, you're going to invite a number of candidates to a one-way interview, and then the system is going to do something that rates or selects those candidates based on their performance in that interview. That's a really important function, right? Like, it's really important who the system picks. So that's an area where we'll probably see some more challenges, some more regulation as well. And then finally, this is probably going to be one of the last to get regulated, but performance management tools. So when we're using technology to say, who are our top performers, who should get more compensation, who should get advanced to the next stage of their career. And then, of course, on the flip side, who is going to be affected by a reduction in force, whose performance is so bad that we should consider letting them go. To the extent that that we're doing some of those with our automated tools, that's a really good example of what we're going to be talking about here as well. Let's now dive into kind of a brief overview of what some of the ethical or DEI considerations are as we think about the use of ethical tools. And we're going to talk about three aspects of it. We're going to talk about transparency, bias or bias prevention, more accurately. And we're going to talk about explainability. And I love to give this background because it gives a little bit of context to why is there regulation in this space? Like, why are we here talking about some of the challenges and not only the opportunities? And also, as AI just gets to be more important in our lives, these are kind of like the three pillar issues when we talk about AI safety or, AI governance. And that's been in the news a lot in the last few weeks. So I think it's a really good background for professionals generally. The first is transparency. So transparency refers in our HR context to an applicant's ability to, first of all, understand that an automated or AI platform is being used. So the idea that if you're applying for a job, that there's an automated platform that's going to be used to help make that decision. Secondly, we know what data is being used for training and what data is being used for decision making. Let me draw that distinction a little bit because it's really important. So when a machine learning or an AI-driven algorithm is created, it gets trained with data, right? So we have a system that we put a bunch of data into our system. In this context, for example, we have an AI-driven system for hiring. We put a bunch of resume data, right, from our past applicants into the system. That's the training data. It's important to know where that comes from, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's so important in a second. And the second aspect to understanding the data is decision making, right? So the algorithm is making some decisions to advance some candidates and not advance others. What are the criteria that the system is using to make those decisions? And then thirdly, we want to make sure that there's an ability to opt out or to request accommodation. We're going to talk about EEOC a little bit later, but last year the EEOC was really specific in talking about how some of these AI-based tools are being used and making sure that applicants with disabilities are either able to use the tools or able to request accommodation or opt out. Transparency is super important from a compliance perspective, and every single regulation that I have read, doing this every day, from something like New York Local Law 144, which is going into effect in 2 months, to some of the earliest draft legislation, everyone I've ever seen has had some transparency considerations. So I really think that in the next year, we should all expect as HR professionals that our applicants are going to understand what tools are being used to judge their applications and why. And I think that that's kind of clear why we as citizens want that to happen as well, right? So if there's systems that are being used to kind of judge what we're doing, we want to know what those systems are and how they're making their decisions. Let's talk next about bias. Let me talk about this kind of a high level, and I've got a very specific example of this. So bias in this context relates to the possibility of the automated system potentially misusing especially protected classifications like race or gender, et cetera, to make hiring and termination decisions. the biggest source of bias in HR tools is how the system is trained. So you recall that we talked on the previous slide regarding transparency, that every AI or machine learning system is trained with data. There's this phrase in data science, it's kind of like a pejorative phrase, but it's called garbage in, garbage out. What it means is if you feed a system bad data, your expectation should be that the results that come out of that system are also going to be problematic. In the AI hiring context, what this means is that if we train our systems in a way with data that has that bias in it, our expectation and the thing that we're concerned about, that we're trying to fix, is that the decisions that come out of that system are going to reinforce or replicate those problems. So if we think about, all of us are really invested in trying to make sure our hiring decisions are fair, that we're addressing sort of like historically disadvantaged candidates and making sure that they're getting the fair chance in our hiring process. But when that hasn't been the case historically, if that data is in our systems and we use that data to train our AI-based systems, we'll replicate that data. Most of that bias, in my experience for sure, is unintentional. And I say that because I want to make sure people understand that the issue is not that, there's like evil vendors or evil employers that are trying to misuse these systems, right? Probably there are some, right? But the 99% chance that we're not trying to do that. We're trying to do the right thing as HR practitioners, but that data has already existed previously in our system. So we have to take steps to eradicate that in order to get fair AI or machine learning based tools. And finally, when the EEOC has talked about this issue, it did last year in the context of disability, as I had mentioned, it's really clear that they say an employer can't blame the algorithm, right? So the employer can't simply say, well, we got this from a vendor and something happened and it didn't, and now now there's disparate impact in our hiring and it doesn't look good. The EEOC is clear, right? It's up to us as employers, as HR professionals, to reduce that bias. Let's look at a really clear historical example. So in 2014, Amazon designed an algorithm to judge software engineering candidates based on the candidates that they had hired previously. So who had already been successful in Amazon. However, at that time, Amazon's workforce was dominated by men in software engineering. So the algorithm systemically learned to prefer men. So it would do things like, for example, look at who had attended a women's college, look at who had field hockey on their resume as opposed to football or something. That's not good, obviously. The users of the algorithm found that and told it explicitly, don't look for gender markers, right? Don't use that as part of the decision. But then the algorithm kept replicating that challenge, right? So it started to do things like look for more masculine language in resumes and prefer that candidates. So we had, so Amazon ended up having to discontinue that system. So that's a great example where the training data that's used, it has the potential to kind of replicate that bias. And those are the challenges that we're looking for. Okay, the next issue, we talked about bias, we talked about transparency. The third and final issue is explainability. Explainability is the ability of human users to understand why an algorithm is making the decisions that it's making, and in part, to judge whether those decisions are legally and ethically justifiable, right? So if our algorithm is making decisions based on years of experience, on certifications or degrees, those things are broadly justifiable. Whereas if our algorithm is making decisions, as in the Amazon example, based on gender or based on race, sexual orientation, et cetera, those are not justifiable. There's a distinction that's made in AI and data science between monitored and unmonitored systems. And a monitored system is a system where we understand why the system is making the decisions it's making, and we're communicating with our algorithms, and they're telling us, right? It's reporting out. It's a computer system. It's not telling us verbally, but it's reporting out like, hey, here are the factors that we're considering. So we as HR leaders can then look at that and say, well, wait a second, that's not what you should be considering. Don't consider that. Compare that to what's called unmonitored algorithms, which is kind of like when you think about like a black box in AI. You're telling it, just tell me what the best candidates are, and that's where it's starting to surface some of these problems. And if it's not explainable, we as professionals are not able to know that that's the case. Here's a case study, and the source is down there if anyone wants to read a little bit more about this. So a company was using a resume screening tool, and there was an audit conducted of the tool, and it found that the tool thought there were two factors most predictive of job performance. Number one, that the candidate's name was Justin. Number two, that the candidate played lacrosse in high school, right? So a gender marker and then a marker of high socioeconomic status. Those are, of course, not what we're supposed to be hiring for, right? We all know that that's not the right approach. So being able to have the system report back and then us as leaders say, like, wait a second, that's not what we should be doing. That's super important. Okay, so as we think about this and how this connects up with DEI, we talked about transparency, we talked about bias prevention, we talked about explainability. These are kind of like the three pillars that hold up AI safety or AI fairness. And I think that they relate to most of what we're trying to accomplish in our DEI efforts as well, right? So we're trying to get a reduced amount of bias. We're trying to get to try to have our systems be where everyone understands what the hiring decisions are. So I think that DEI leaders have really kind of taken to this approach as well as we start to consider, how does this look over the next 10 years as we're using more and more of this technology? Okay, let's talk about regulation a little bit. Mary Claire, I see your question. Let me hold that to the end of our discussion and we'll definitely get to it. So in 2023, there's a wave of regulation that's coming to these systems. Now, there's always, of course, been regulation hiring, particularly in things like pre-hire assessments. They've been regulated for decades, right, since the 70s. But now there's this new wave of laws that's going to regulate automated systems particularly. One of them, and it's the first law of its kind, and obviously very germane to us as New York SHRM, is New York City Local Law 144. We're going to deep dive into this law, the first of its kind. But for now, I just want to be clear, New York is going to be the first, right? So we're dealing with this issue kind of on the vanguard in New York City, but we are going to have statewide legislation that does somewhat similar things, very likely in New Jersey, in California, which almost always replicates kind of like when New York does something first, California then does it next. New Hampshire, the state of New York just proposed some legislation in this area, and Washington, D.C. So we're going to see lots of statewide legislation here. Additionally, we are going to see federal and international legislation. So I'd mentioned the EEOC is looking into this issue. The EEOC has identified the issue of algorithmic hiring bias as one of its top 3 regulatory priorities over the next 5 years. So our federal regulators are taking a very, very close look at this. There'll probably be more guidance and more regulation either end of this year or next. And I always mention, for those that are interested in reading more, the White House has issued what they call an AI Bill of Rights, which the White House has then indicated that federal agencies should use to guide these regulations. So we'll see this coming from EEOC, but it's likely that we'll also see regulation around the use of artificial intelligence from organizations like the FTC, from labor regulators. This is going to be a big issue. There's also going to be substantial regulation of the use of AI in hiring by the European Union. And I mentioned that, we don't all deal with the European Union on a daily basis, but, I think back to when a couple of years ago, every website was just like, rolling along, whatever. And then a month later, every single website had, do you accept the cookies, yes or no banner, right? So that was GDPR, and GDPR comes out, and of course, European companies comply, but most companies internationally decided to comply with GDPR because, first of all, they wanted to do business within the European Union if they're international at all. And secondly, they saw that the first organizations to do regulation in this space oftentimes got copied by other countries. So, especially for us that have kind of a global selling footprint and global workforce, it'll be important for us to look at what is Europe doing, what is Canada doing. Canada's looking at this very closely. And so those are things that we'll keep in mind as well. But let's deep dive today into New York City Local Law 144 and spend a significant amount of our time here. So this is New York City Local Law 144 of 2021 is its official title, or sometimes it's called the Automated Employment Decision Tool Law. Oftentimes people just call it the New York Bias Law as well. It went into effect, or passed in 2021. It goes into effect on July 5th, 2023. It's been delayed several times, but we now have the final rules, and we have every reason to expect this is to be the final date. The penalties are very substantial for companies that don't comply. So the penalty is up to $3,000 per day per violation. So for the number of unaudited tools, we'll talk about what the audit means in a second, that a company uses, they could face up to a $1,500 per day fine per tool, plus a $1,500 a day fine for not posting the notification requirements about the use of that tool. And we'll talk about that in a second, but I think for a medium to large company that's using a number of HR tools, there will be companies out there that are getting $10,000 per day fine for not complying with this law. The law applies to companies that are hiring New York City employees, including companies that are hiring in New York City remotely. So it's not that, if a company's not, headquartered officially in New York City, the law still likely applies when they have offices and employees here in New York. The law requires audits, and we'll talk about what the audit is in a second, of automated employment decision tools. So tools that produce, again, quoting from the regulations, a score, a classification, or a recommendation that substantially assists discretionary decision-making in hiring. That's a mouthful, right? And a lot of companies are going to be confused about whether or not this applies to them. I'm not a lawyer and I don't give legal advice, but the way that we talk about this really at a high level is if you're using HR technology that scores job applicants or that sorts job applicants, the law is quite likely to apply to you and to apply to your tools. Let's talk about the two parts of this law. The first, and by far the most challenging to comply with, is the requirement of getting a bias audit for these tools. So companies that use covered tools have to conduct an annual bias audit and has to be conducted by an independent auditor. So the vendor of your tool cannot do this themselves. They may commission an independent auditor to do it and then can send those results on to individual employers. And there's some nuance there. So we'll talk about that in a second too. But the vendor can't just say like, oh yeah, we looked at this and it's fine. Further, the bias audit can't be conducted internally by the employer itself. So it's not something where your HR team or the compliance team or even the legal team can just sit down and do these things. You have to get someone on the outside to do it, much like a financial audit would be done externally. The bias audit looks at the outputs of each of these tools and compares the outputs of the tool across racial and ethnic groups, gender, and the intersection of those groups. So we say, we put, 1,000 applicants through this tool. Here are the percentages that pass the tool by men versus women, by the different gender and by different ethnic and racial groups, and then the intersections of those groups, right? So we're reporting separately on, here's the pass rate for this tool for Asian women versus here is the pass rate for this tool from Native American men, for example. The audit must then be linked conspicuously, as the law says, on the careers and jobs page. So this is really a tough animal, right? So it's not that doing the audit is particularly onerous. If you have the data, it's not hard, although having the data can be some of the challenge. But it's pretty unusual for a company to put something like this and expose themselves publicly to discussions of disparate impact in hiring publicly on their website. So that's why this is something that really has people concerned, and that's why we're trying to get out ahead of it. Here's an example of part of the output that comes from an audit. And we took this directly from the guidance that New York City has given us from DCWP, which is the Department of Consumer and Workforce Protection, which is in charge of this law. And it shows, as you can see there, all the different categories. Again, this is not a particularly well-constructed chart, so it's kind of hard to read, but this is what the city gave us. So we see in the first row, Hispanic or Latino men. In this example, there was 205 applicants. 90 were selected. The selection rate is simply selected divided by number of applicants. And then the impact ratio is the comparison of the selection rate for that group versus the selection rate for the group with the highest selection rate, right? So for example, we are comparing Hispanic men, not just how many passed, but how many passed this portion of the hiring assessment versus the other groups. That's how we get to the impact ratio. For those of us that have kind of been on the compliance side or on the legal side before, this looks a lot like a disparate impact analysis, and that's basically what it is, right? So this is kind of taking those disparate impact analyses that companies have been doing since literally the 1970s, kind of just bringing it into this next era of AI. The second major provision of New York City Local Law 144 are notification requirements. So certain disclosures have to be made on an organization's website or to candidates. First of all, that an automated tool is going to be used and how it's utilized in the hiring process. So again, remember we had this discussion about transparency. This is the transparency portion of this law. We have to talk about what data is collected, how the data is retained, and then how the tool is going to be used to kind of in that final employment decision. Candidates have to be informed they can request an alternative assessment or accommodation. And in one of the weirdest parts of this law, it says in the regulation that we have to provide information on how to request an alternative assessment or accommodation, but then explicitly it says that the employer doesn't have to provide an alternative selection process. So I put that in there just so we know, like, we have to provide information on how to do or on how a candidate can request this, but we're kind of still looking for clarification from New York on a couple of these elements, even as the law is going into effect. The notification language is usually provided by the audit vendor. Like in our work, we provide this on we customize it for the client based on the results of the audit, tell them exactly what it should say and where it should go. Usually that's going through corporate counsel or retained counsel as well. The notification requirements are not hard, right? So if you think about these two elements of New York City 144, the bias audit and posting and the notification requirements, the bias audit and posting is kind of 90% of the work and 90% of the concern and headaches, I would say. And the notification is like 10%, right? So this is, you got to do it, but it's not nearly as challenging as the rest. One of the really interesting aspects, I get this question all the time, is like, what counts for disparate impact or what counts for the pass fail? For New York City 144, the pass is simply doing those two things, conducting the audit and posting the notification requirements. According to New York City 144, you're free to use a tool that is just like swimming in terrible bias as long as you say what that bias is and put it on your website. So there's no particular result of the audit that's pass or fail. You just have to do the audit and put it on your website. But of course, right, we think one step ahead on this. If we're using a tool that shows significant disparate impact, and then we're putting it out there publicly as we're required by the law to do, we have to think about what to do with that, right? So New York City 144 may not care, but EEOC cares, right? Other state bodies are likely going to care. So when there is a tool that's in use that shows some disparate impact, there's a couple things that we do. So first of all, we always want to bring in legal counsel, especially in larger organizations where there's compliance professionals on the legal team. Secondly, we usually will go back to the vendor and see what they have in terms of their validity report. So vendors in this space have been doing validity reports a lot. We want to see what that looks like, make sure that they have one. On our end as well, we're then doing some more analysis if we see some disparate impact, understanding first of all, what are the statistical significance of the result, especially when we're doing this intersectional analysis. So when we saw that graph with all those different groups, all the races times men and women, oftentimes there will be groups in there that are relatively small. So for example, Native Hawaiians are their own line item in this chart. Native Hawaiians are 0.6% of the population of New York City, roughly in the last census. And we are now, with these final rules of this law, able to take really small groups that are not statistically significant out of our analysis. But those are the things that, as we kind of think about how does this work in practice, how do we deal with some of these challenges if disparate impact is shown, that's how we're starting to think about those issues. And then, finally, if there are tools that aren't really critical to the business, sometimes we stop using those tools, right? And that's one of those things that we can do until the vendor is able to resolve some of those issues. Okay, now here is the slide where I talk about all the reactions that people have to this law. And I understand all of this, right? So I've been a business owner for 14 years. I've run organizations from 0 to 400 people. And so I've dealt with lots of new regulations too, right? I mean, I've been through these compliance challenges. A lot of people are probably going to do the wait and see approach, or have been. I think that the number of people that we are talking to now that are in wait and see mode has gone down substantially, because we now have the final rules for 144 and we have the final date of July 5th, and this law goes into effect. a couple of things that people will talk about. First of all, there's a big unknown here as to how effectively and how quickly New York City will be able to enforce the law. Now, I don't have any expectation that on July 5th, New York City will have, 20,000 letters ready to go out to employers telling everyone in this whole city that they're all in violation of this law. Like, that's probably not what's going to happen. So there's some question about how quickly this will happen. Secondly, and related to that enforcement question, it's not clear at all how fines are calculated. So are fines going to be calculated from the date that the law goes into effect? Or do the fines start to be calculated from when New York City basically fines companies that are not in compliance and issues them, a notification that they're not in compliance? So that's not clear at all. Finally, there's this language in the law about substantially assist that we talked about. And I kind of made reference to how lots of employers, lots of vendors, and lots of attorneys are trying to think through, does the law apply to them? Or can we get out of it, right? So there's a big question there. And I think there's a lot of people that are kind of going to be trying to make the argument that this law doesn't apply to the tools that they're using. But there's a couple considerations there that I always mention. The first is that compliance for this law, I mean, yes, it's going to be inconvenient. It's going to be a little bit of extra work and extra expense, but it's going to be much less expensive than even just having lawyers go through and spend a lot of time on this, right? So when we have the choice between getting this box checked and also in a way which I think has really positive implications for, our DEI and our fairness commitments within the organization, that's going to be a pretty good thing compared with spending, weeks trying to fight this from a legal perspective. Secondly, I always tell people, even if we think that this one specific law doesn't apply to them because there's like a, like loophole or something that general counsel wants to try to get us through, this wave is clearly coming, right? So it's clear that, we've got the New York City law, we'll have California law, we'll have New York State law, we'll have DC law, we'll have federal regulation. So it's important that smart HR leaders are starting to get out in front of this regulatory issue, even if it's something that doesn't, like, to the letter of the law, might not apply to them now. This idea of auditing our tools for fairness, like it's not going away. It's only going to get bigger. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about what HR leaders should be doing to prepare now. And I think about this in a couple of categories, and love to get even more questions about it. So keep sending those questions, and we'll get to them at the end. So first of all, it's time to start thinking through, what should we do to comply specifically with New York 144? And there's a couple different things. The first is, I think it's really important for organizations to think about this cross-functionally. So I think that HR leaders should sit down, with senior executives, with the legal team, and think through what are the different tools that are in use and whether or not they're going to fall under this law, and start to get a perspective on that. I think that one of the dangers of this law is that, especially in larger organizations, so many tools are in use that it might be the case that, that legal doesn't have a good list of what's being used in HR. This would be a good time to get that down. Secondly, plan ahead for the July 5th deadline. So companies that have to comply should be starting now to start thinking, how do they get that audit taken care of? In our process, it takes somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks. So we take clients now, we'll take clients up to and past the enforcement date, but it does require a little bit of planning. This is not, like for GDPR, like you can get the accept cookies thing on your website in 5 minutes, although there's more to GDPR than that, right? But it's not going to be that easy, right? It's not something you can kind of flip the switch on and off. And finally, as you're evaluating new AI tools, and especially those that are doing those core tasks of sorting, assessing, and interview tech, make sure that your vendors are thinking about this issue and have a perspective. More generally, kind of going up a level from just the New York law, make sure to be thinking about your AI prep strategies at the same time, right? And so it's kind of similar stuff, right? Make a catalog of all the tools that are in use, reach out to your vendors to make sure you understand their compliance plans, and make sure that the vendors can give you a validity study that shows that their tools are fair and unbiased. And if they can't, think about how you can do those things internally. Most vendors are, in my experience now, or at least thinking about this a couple months out. And then finally, it's important to be on lookout for emerging compliance. So it's make sure that you're on, I know the national SHRM listserv sends out that list of compliance items, I think on a monthly basis. So doing those things, going to conferences, et cetera, making sure that you're keeping up on what's coming out. but I always think of, this thing the EEOC said, and we talked about it a couple times, where the EEOC is clear, you can't blame the algorithm, right? So we as employers, as HR leaders, it's really clear that we can't simply say like, okay, the vendor did it, we're off the hook. New York City Local Law 144 is super clear. This compliance obligation falls on the employer. So we want to be really, really thoughtful as we think through that through. There we go. Oh, skip one. Okay. I'm going to go through questions in 1 second. I'm totally happy to answer questions now. And if folks want to reach out to me, I'm more than happy to talk further. Anyone who wants to email me, I'm happy to send out a copy of the slides. We have an applicability checklist for Local Law 144 we can send out. We have a mailing list that we send out monthly updates on this issue of AI and hiring. And then happy to do consultations with folks that want to talk this over a little bit more thoroughly. As I mentioned, like this is the work that we do on a daily basis. So let me dive into the questions. So Mary Claire, thanks for sending a couple of questions out. So when the ATS asks about race and gender, does the employer not see this info, or where does it go? That's a really good question. So sometimes this is captured in the ATS and sometimes it's not. I think generally, we as hiring managers know our own processes, so we know what we're seeing and what we're not. One of the challenges of this law, and it's a big challenge, is that oftentimes there's a disjunction between who has the data that where we can actually do this audit, right? Because I've seen situations where the ATS vendor says, well, we have this data about who we got in the top end. We don't know who got hired, and we don't retain this issue, this information on gender and race. Whereas the employer says, like, well, we don't have that information either, right? Like, we don't mark down the race of especially of our job candidates that don't end up getting hired. So I think that if you're concerned about this issue and you're an HR leader, you want to make sure that you're understanding, like, where is that stored? Where does specifically race/ethnicity and gender information get stored, to make sure that you're retaining that information. Let's see. Mary Claire also asks, the ATS could view applications negatively if you have more years of experience than what the job requires, which points to ageism. Do I agree that that happens? Yeah, I agree that that's a potential thing that could happen, right? So I'm not sure that I can say definitively like this negative thing happens. But it's definitely the case that that's a concern. In fact, Workday, like one of the largest HR information system vendors, just got sued, and it was because of this issue, this ageism issue. Like, a man was applying for several jobs at a company, and the Workday algorithm kept denying him, and ultimately he's filed this lawsuit, which is probably one of the first of its kind, suing a vendor directly for this issue. So I think that that's a good question. I think it probably does happen. Let's see. And then Mary Claire asks, screening questions of the ATS as part of the application process, does that fall under scoring and sorting or not? Yes, I think that will, right? So anytime that our systems are doing things to help us rank candidates against one another or score candidates against one another, that's very likely to be something that's going to be regulated. All right, William. Oh, hi, William. Nice to see you again. Let's see. William says, under the 144 law, is there any requirement on doing updates to the intersectional disparate impact analysis annually, more often, or no requirement? So yes, so the law requires that we get annual audits of these systems. And so let's think about actually two different scenarios, right? So one scenario is, let's say we're talking about a tool that's already in use, that's likely to continue in use. So the employer has to get an audit of those systems by the July 5th date. And then every year thereafter, where we update the audit based on the new results. The other side of it is there's a requirement that employers, after the July 5th date, if they're going to use a new vendor that's going to fall under this law, they still have to get an assessment. And the way that they do it is they have to ask the vendor basically for test data or a test assessment. And that's where having that partnership with the vendor is really important. And that's definitely a place where you should have the expectation as you go out to new vendors that they've thought about this and thought about how do they onboard new clients and make sure that their new clients are 144 compliant. But then it's clear from the law that once an employer has significant actual historical data on the use of the tool, that then they must use that on an annual basis to conduct the audits. All right, Ellen asks, how long would it take until companies can comply? So companies have to comply by July 5th. In my experience, the work that we do internally takes probably 2 to 4 weeks per client, but there's more to it than that, right? So there's a lot of internal employer work that's going to have to go into it as well. So first of all, we need to make sure that we can get the data out of people's systems, and we, as the auditor, and we can help with that, right? So we don't usually go into people's systems. Like we get our client partners to pull that out for us, but we have to make sure that that data is available. And then honestly, like the biggest thing that takes a substantial amount of time is getting HR, executive leaders, and especially legal aligned on this, right? Because when you go to legal and say, what we're going to do is we're going to do this audit and we're going to put potential evidence of disparate impact publicly on our website, like brains start to like pop open, right? And I've seen this happen quite a bit. And so legals going to want to take some time with this. So it's definitely the kind of thing that you want to start like basically now, right? We have a little bit more than 2 months. And honestly, I think that this is a funny law, and the fact that it created this whole need and this whole industry for auditors, and there just aren't that many, right? So that's the work that we do. We've got some competitors that you can and should consider as well, but the folks that are doing this work are it's going to be like it's going to be like early April at tax time for accountants, right? So it's going to be a little hard for folks to get in. So plan ahead. Elise says, will this law have a specific look back period / number of years, and the law starts on July 5th? That's a really good question. So the look back period is either 1 year or the start date of the tool. So for some reason, the law has like a specific language around when the law started. They say it's the distribution, or sorry, when the tool started to be used, called the distribution date. So we're either looking back from the start of the use of the tool or 1 year, whichever is longer, basically. Really good question. Marie Claire says, assume if we use the ATS but don't screen or sort through the system, that would not be required audit, correct? Yes. So, so again, Marie Claire, if you want to specifically talk about your use case, send me an email and we'll talk, because I don't like to give definitive statements without all the information. But generically, if what you're using your ATS for is that you're collecting resumes, and then a real actual live human being is looking at each resume and making the decisions which to move on, that action does not have to be audited, and it's not regulated right now. It's particularly confusing because one of the questions I get really frequently is like, okay, John, just send me the list of tools that need to be audited, and if my tool is on there, then I'll deal with it. It's actually not that easy, right? Because different tools get used in different ways. Almost every ATS system has some automated tools, but it's a really important distinction whether or not you're using them and which ones you're using and how you're using them as well, right? Because sometimes people will use something like a personality assessment, which is like informational but doesn't have a sorting function. An example of what that is, for example, like let's say not a lot of people use Myers-Briggs anymore. I think that's kind of like a little bit outmoded, but for some people still use Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs gives you those letters like INTJ, whatever. That's what I am. If you're asked the system for some reason to say like, okay, only show me INTJs, like that's auditable. But if you're only using that information and then taking that kind of as part of the consideration as a human for who you hire, that's probably not auditable. Whereas if we say like, okay, here's an assessment, we're going to grade you out of a score of 1 to 100, that is more auditable. All right, Williams says, are you hearing about any legal challenges being mounted to 144 requirements? No, and I'm a little surprised. I'm 100% sure that we'll see this. A little bit longer answer, William, is that this has been, this is local law of 2021, right? So this has been in process for several years, and we've had several rounds of public testimony. And every time we have rounds of public testimony, we have the lawyers from ADP, we have the lawyers from Workday show up to give public testimony, as of course is their right. So that's the right thing to be doing. So it's really clear that these large vendors know that this law as currently written applies to them, that it presents some really onerous requirements, not only on themselves as vendors, but upon all of their customers. And I think most importantly, there's aspects of the law that are super unclear, right? I mean, it's New York City's right to ask companies to do things that are hard, but it's a little bit more challenging for them for New York City to ask companies to do things that are functionally impossible. Specifically, what I mean is, if this data is not stored to do these audits, it's really hard to ask to ask a company to do it. So I think that there will definitely be legal challenges mounted. My perspective on it is great to follow those. I don't think that this law is going to be like repealed in the next 2 months. And, you know, going back to what I'd said earlier, I think that this New York law, I'm sure, because the next generation of laws are already coming. This is going to want to be, this is the first of its kind, but it's not the only one of its kind. Think about it as like pay transparency, right? Lots of folks thought that, okay, here's pay transparency coming down the pike in like Colorado, like New York. So like, we got to make some adjustments if we hire in those states. But then it was California, then it's a bunch of other states to talk about it federally. So it's one of those things where, you know, yeah, is it possible to kind of like find loopholes or have legal challenges to this one law? Sure. But I'm here to tell you, like, this is going to be a national trend. Oh, Marie Claire, thanks for answering all my questions. It's my pleasure to answer your questions. Feel free to email me if you have any more. If there are more, those are all the questions that I had queued there. I'm looking in the chat box as well. Anu asks, yes, I'm happy to send the slides. Juliana also asked for the slides. Yep, totally happy. And thanks to the folks at SHRM, we're going to send these out. Are there any other questions? I should have a last call. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to send them over. And just as I wait for that for the last second, again, totally happy to talk about this. I spend all day, basically every day, dealing with this law and these issues. So I really enjoy talking about it. Let me give my thanks to New York SHRM, to all the folks that spent their time getting the webinar together. Thank you very much. I'm available, as I said, email me, come to our website, get the slides from New York SHRM. Madeline, thank you so much for your attendance. I appreciate it. Yeah, and I'll turn it back over.